When mass shootings happen here in America, we tend to divide ourselves into two groups. Some of us want more gun control legislation. Others of us are completely opposed to that idea. In fact, probably right now you find yourself in one of those two groups. These two groups, totally opposed to each other, give us a stalemate. And that stalemate doesn't give us any of the answers that we need. In fact, when we join in the fight on one side or the other, that often closes us off from the possibility of finding any common ground. And if we're going to find solutions, we first need to find some common ground. We've got a second problem as well. Whenever we get shaken up by one of these events, we start looking for answers in the same familiar, obvious places. Someone calls for a ban on military-style weapons. We talk about restrictions on who can buy guns. We talk about making large-capacity magazines illegal, and so forth. And all of the most obvious answers all say gun control. But most of these obvious answers have either been tried before and met with little success, or we can already tell in advance that they probably won't be very effective, because most of the things that get proposed would not have made a difference to the tragedy that we're responding to. In December of 2015, Senator Marco Rubio made a pretty bold claim. He said that none of the recent major mass shootings would have been stopped by any of the gun control laws that anybody had proposed. So Glenn Kessler, who was a reporter with the Washington Post, fact-checked Rubio's claim. He went back and looked at all of the major mass shootings over the previous 3 years, and he was forced to conclude that Senator Rubio was right. Then, last year, a writer for 538 named Leah Libresco, who used to be really frustrated because it seemed to her that we just couldn't pass any new gun control laws, spent 3 months going through the research that we have on such laws. And it wasn't just her. It was her and a bunch of her colleagues. When they were all done, she wrote an article for the Washington Post titled, "I used to think gun control was the answer. My research told me otherwise." Ms. Libresco ended her article by saying that very few of the usual proposals actually work, and the best way that she could find to save lives was by seeking to protect specific kinds of victims, such as women with abusive partners, and to put forth effort into reforming people who might become killers. She specifically mentioned sweeping bans focused on the guns themselves as being a waste of resources and time. All of this reminds me of a quote. We cannot solve the significant problems we face at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. That quote seems to have been inspired, at least, by Albert Einstein. So if our goal is to save lives, we need some fresh, creative thinking. First, we need to look for things we can do that will really, truly have a positive effect, not just make us feel like we did something. And secondly, those things need to be politically doable. In order for a proposal to work, we have to be able to get it into law. I have 7 proposals today, and every one of them meets both of these characteristics. Every one is likely to actually make a difference, and none of them have any real impact on ordinary American citizens. For that reason, I think that almost all of us, including those of us who are gun owners, ought to be able to say yes to these ideas. Here they are. Number 1, it's time to stop giving fame to mass shooters. We need to ask all major news media to just stop publishing the names and photos of these people. So instead of, I'm not going to say his name, but instead of so-and-so, we talk about the Parkland shooter. And maybe instead of focusing quite so much on the shooters, we should focus a bit more on the victims and the heroes, who in almost every case have tried to save them. Others have suggested that we need to be careful to use terms that avoid in any way glamorizing the guilty party. Perpetrator, for example, is probably a better term than lone wolf or school shooter. In fact, the most recent perpetrator left an online comment bragging, and I quote, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." Now, I'm not talking here about censoring our free press. I am talking about asking our free press if they will voluntarily adopt voluntary standards for the good of our communities. You see, traditionally, news organizations avoid ever publishing the names of rape victims. There's no law that says they should do this, and yet they do. It's a standard adopted by the profession. And they've very seldom published the names of minors who are either accused of crimes or who've been victimized by adults. If our news organizations would adopt a similar standard in regard to the names and photos of mass shooters, it would help stop at least some such future tragedies. And doing this still allows for complete reporting on the shooter's history, psychology, and known motives. But it deprives such individuals of the fame that so many of them are seeking. Now, why would this help? Let me give an example. One of these shooters, whom I'm not going to name except as the Umpqua Community College shooter in Oregon, wrote the following in August of 2015 about a previous perpetrator. I have noticed that so many people like him are all alone and unknown. Yet when they spill a little blood, the whole world knows who they are. A man who is known by no one is now known by everyone. His face splashed across every screen, his name across the lips of every person on the planet. All in the course of one day. Seems the more people you kill, the more you're in the limelight. 1 month later, the Umpqua Community College shooter walked onto his campus with 6 guns, murdered 9 people, and wounded 8 more. And yes, the perpetrator himself died, but in his own mind, he died famous. Depriving these individuals of the fame and the limelight that many of them are looking for would get rid of one of the motivations that contribute to such shootings. Number 2, we need to tell the whole story and destroy the allure that some people see in committing these crimes. I've never seen this suggestion from anybody else, and yet this could make a significant difference. You see, mass shooters often study and become obsessed with the stories of previous perpetrators. And as far as they can see, those stories end in a blaze of glory. There's a burst of action, an enormous impact on other people, followed by a whole spotlight of national publicity and fame. But the story does not end there, and we need to make sure that people who would think of doing such a thing get the entire story. The full truth destroys the narrative, and the myth of a mass shooting is something that is in any way desirable for anybody, especially including the would-be perpetrator. We now have dozens of perpetrators of mass shootings locked up behind bars. And it's safe to say that most of these, if they had the opportunity to go back and not do what they have done, would happily do so in a heartbeat. Every mass shooting begins with a fantasy that the perpetrator will get satisfaction of some kind out of committing the crime. These people imagine that somehow the attention and the infamy that they achieve are going to be worth the crime. The truth is way different. The truth is a mass shooting doesn't solve anything for the perpetrator, and it always makes that person's problems much worse than they already were. Up until the moment his crime begins, that person has a future. A mass shooting destroys that completely, and forever. And as most living perpetrators could tell you, the few minutes of fame soon give way to a lifetime of regret. We need to interview as many past perpetrators as we can who will tell others the truth, that if you plan and carry out a shooting, you are going to regret it every day from now on. And your life will either be very short, which means whatever future you might have had is already over, or it will be very long, and in that case, you will have no future as well. Only long, long years of being locked up like an animal every hour of every day for the rest of your life. And by the way, the fame and the limelight will quickly fade, and you will be completely forgotten with no way out. And we need to show people the reality of what that is like. We also need to find ways to give hope to people who would think of committing such a crime. These are acts of desperation carried out by people who already believe that they have no future. Almost all of these people feel that they're already at the end of the road. We need to show them convincingly that what may look right now like the end of the road is only a curve. And instead of stepping on the accelerator and creating a fiery end, what they actually need to do is slow down and make a major change in direction, because there is still so much life ahead of them. And they need to have the hope that life and a future are possible in their case. So the voice of past perpetrators urging others not to make the same mistake that they made, this needs to become a big part of the narrative of what a mass shooting is really all about. Each one of these mass shootings ends up with its own Wikipedia article. As many of these as possible should include the perpetrator's plea for others to get the help that they need and not to follow in their steps. And every article should also be linked to the right resources to do so. If we can convince young people who are at risk of doing this that they still have a future if only they will choose the right path, and if we can provide them with the resources that they need to connect with that future, and I'll say more on this in a minute, then we can make a difference. Number 3, we need to bar gun sales to convicted stalkers, convicted violent criminals, and people with an obvious history of mental illness that involves violence. In addition, if a person gets convicted of a serious violent crime, he or she should be required to surrender or relinquish any firearms that person may possess. There was a recent study on laws that require such people to relinquish their firearms, and that study found that relinquishment laws are nearly 50% more effective than non-relinquishment laws at reducing domestic violence. And you might be surprised to hear it, but more than a fifth of public mass shootings begin with domestic disputes. All of the measures I've just named have high public support and a chance to make a real impact. However, the law needs to be carefully written to carefully define who it applies to so that we don't place burdens on the wrong people. We should also bar gun sales to suspected terrorists, although again, there needs to be clear ways for innocent people to get off of that list in a timely manner. All of these things can help. However, most people who commit mass killings do not have diagnosable mental illnesses. And fortunately, terrorist attacks are rare. That's part of why we also need our next suggestion. Number 4, we need to strengthen our prevention by maintaining, supporting, and expanding things like the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, too. This FBI unit assesses potential threats anytime they're reported by concerned citizens. Then they step in to help stop people who've been ID'd as potential perpetrators of mass violence. In many cases, this means a therapeutic approach that helps those individuals permanently find a more positive path in their lives. And this definitely saves lives. For the most part, mass shooters don't just snap all of a sudden. They follow a well-known downward spiral. There were lots of people, for example, who thought that the shooter in our most recent case might well do something exactly like what he did. And these people did talk to authorities, including the FBI. Unfortunately, that information didn't make it to the right people within the FBI, which highlights a breakdown of the system. But we have specialized resources, and we need to make those more easily, directly, reliably accessible to the public. We can do this through a well-publicized specific website and national hotline. This needs to be easily memorable, perhaps along the lines of 1-800-4SAFETY or 1-888-ALL-SAFE. Such a hotline should serve as a useful and positive resource, both for people who fear that they might commit a crime of mass violence and want help, because some of these people would actually use such a resource if one were readily available and presented to them in the right way, and for those who are afraid that somebody they know might commit such a crime. Many of these individuals would really rather that somebody stop them. As one young potential shooter put it, I wanted attention. If someone would have come up to me and said, "You don't have to do this. We accept you. I would have broken down and given up. We have to do better at identifying and intervening with people who are obsessed with weapons, who have expressed the intention to do harm to others. Fortunately, the young man I just mentioned actually was stopped, just short of mass murder. He served 8.5 years in prison, and then he was released to begin a new life. He is grateful that he was stopped before he killed somebody. Number 5. We need to fix our national background check system, the one we call NICS. Sometimes our state and local authorities have records that would disqualify dangerous people from buying guns. And yet that information doesn't make it into our national system. We need to fix this. This has bipartisan support, so we just need to get it done. Number 6. We should make bump stocks illegal. As you undoubtedly know, these were used in the 2017 Las Vegas shooting to make semi-automatic rifles fire like machine guns. Fully automatic weapons have been tightly regulated since 1934. It makes no sense that you can easily buy a device that effectively converts a regular semi-automatic weapon into a machine gun. Now, making bump stocks illegal probably isn't going to stop a really determined shooter from making his own, but it could well reduce the harm from less determined or less resourceful shooters. And obviously, there's only been one major bump stock involved shooting so far. But with a large number of people killed and injured in that one incident, it's worth doing something about easily abusable bump stocks, which are so rarely used by ordinary citizens that very few gun owners had even heard of them before the Las Vegas incident. Finally, number 7. School administrators and teachers need to be effectively trained nationwide in what they can do to identify potential threats, how to best intervene, and where to get help. We know some of the things that work and don't work to discourage bullying and isolation in our schools. We need to be sure that the best practices make it into each and every school and each and every classroom. Also, there's been a lot of talk lately about armed defense on campus. One way is to have armed security officers. These have to be both highly committed and well-trained. There was in fact an armed resource officer in Parkland, Florida, who was also a sheriff's deputy. But he failed to go into the building and confront the assailant while the shooting was taking place. And other sheriff's deputies also took up defensive positions and failed to enter the building. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again. An alternative way that people have been talking about is by allowing administrators and teachers to store or carry concealed weapons on campus. In almost every school shooting, there are one or more teachers or administrators who do their best to save students' lives. And some of these feel strongly that they could and would save lives more effectively if they had access to a firearm. In the state of Texas, over 170 school districts actually allow for armed staff or board members on campus right now. These are often rural school districts where police aren't close by. Now, whether your first instinct is to approve of this approach or not, and Americans are certainly split on this issue, we should recognize that it's already being used in some places. Where such measures are taking place, we need to do our best to make sure that they have the best chances of safety and success. We need to train the people involved, for example, in how to make sure that concealed firearms stay both concealed and completely inaccessible to all students at all times. And we also need to carefully evaluate the results of these efforts where they're being used, so that we can find out whether and under what circumstances this approach may be of value. We must also be careful in all cases not to turn our schools into places where violence is simply expected. Instead, we need to safeguard our schools as places of discovery where young people feel safe and can be excited to learn. Now, there's no simple magic remedy that's going to stop every single mass shooting. But if we were to take these 7 proposals and completely put them into practice, and these things are doable, then we could at least make a dent in reducing these events. Along with this, there are a number of other extremely important issues that we need to think about as well. We need to think about gun homicides in general, which kill way more Americans every year, one at a time, than mass shootings do. We need to think about gun suicides, which kill even more of us. And we need to think about several other problems we face that don't get anywhere near as much publicity as mass shootings do, yet are far bigger issues than anything we've talked about so far. I'll touch upon these problems in a follow-up video. In the meantime, if we're willing to turn our energy away from battling with each other, if we're willing to focus on what works, and if we're willing to focus on what we can do that almost all of us find acceptable, we don't have to continue the stalemate. Instead, we can actually make a difference.